In this special episode, we're going to go deep into the coronavirus. What is it, how you can get it, and what to do immediately when you think you've got it to improve your chances of fighting it off. And I'm also going to ask the tough questions of whether you should wear a mask or not, and whether the coronavirus was made in a lab or it's all natural. So stay tuned. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today, my guest is Dr. Bill Code. And Dr. Bill Code, at 42 years old, was at the height of a successful career in anesthesiology, and he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, or MS, which is an autoimmune disorder where the immune system attacks the central nervous system. Dr. Code lost his hospital privileges and could no longer work in that field. In 1997, he attended a conference that actually gave him some hope about MS. He went on a health journey that encompassed not only the various treatment options, including conventional medicine, but also natural medicine. He has since had great results with MS, and he's also the author of multiple books, which we'll talk about in this podcast. But Dr. Code, welcome to the Anti-Aging Hacks Show. I'm really excited to have you here.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here. I'm happily all the same things that help my MS calm down and settle down are relatively anti-aging, so they tie in really well.
Great. Now, you have a fascinating story with your health and how you beat back MS. For the listeners, can you just break that down and give us a background of how you got it and what you did to get past it?
Well, sure. I mean, by the time I was diagnosed, of course, I'd lost most of my strength in the right side. I couldn't empty a syringe, and that's a very big deal to an anesthesiologist, of course. And I was kind of in that pit of despair for 6-12 months easily. I tended to get worse and worse and worse. And I realized as I was taken out of the workplace and everything else that I better start to look at some other outside the regular pattern choices, because most of those tended to do very badly. And particularly men seem to do very badly with MS. And I'm not quite sure why. I've got some theories, but I'm not quite sure why. And so then I started to find little pieces. That conference in 1997 helped. It talked about the advantages of vitamin D, the sunshine vitamin. It talked a lot about maybe some impact from gluten sensitivity and even dairy sensitivity. And of course, those have come on and been much more in fruition. This is in 1996 or 97, actually. So quite some 23 years ago. And then it's a matter of pieces in the journey. I finally felt well enough that I could do exercise. And part of that was by glutathione enhancement, initially with whey protein, and now I don't tolerate it as well. So I go with N-acetylcysteine. And then a very great piece about 6 years ago, I started to learn about hyperbaric oxygen, which I'd heard bits and pieces about before, but I was lucky enough to meet and talk to Dr. Philip James, who's the world guru, I would suggest, on extra oxygen in Dundee, Scotland. Went to visit him. And so that's been a big piece of the journey. I've done over probably 600 of those now, hyperbaric treatments, and I'm lucky enough to have one here in our little farm. So I go in almost daily during these days of being home all the time. I do 6 days a week. And then other pieces I've found, whether it was photobiomodulation, whether it was gut floral transplant, also called microbial transfer therapy, or fecal microbial transplant. So each of these have been a piece, and I think they're a different piece in different groups. I mean, as you and I know, it's important in our health well-being to individualize what we need as an individual and not say, well, we're not all the same. We don't all fit in the same box. And the other piece in that journey is I've come to realize that, what I learned early in medical school, get the diagnosis right, the pharmacist to give you the right drug and everything's good. Well, it doesn't work hardly at all anymore. It's kind of a temporary Band-Aid on symptoms. And we need to find the underlying solution. And usually that's somewhere in our personal experience, whether it's environment, air, water, and food. So if you get those in better shape, you're going to be in better shape.
That's great. I love how you integrate all of these things. Now, today, I want to talk to you about the coronavirus, which is a topic that just won't go away. It's dominating news headlines, but also health concerns around the world. And, I saw you speak at ACEVHI, which stands for Silicon Valley Health Institute, a couple of weeks ago, which is an organization in Silicon Valley that's dedicated to furthering longevity, fighting degenerative diseases through learning, which is a very cool platform that they have. And I was just amazed by the information and knowledge that you had, that I was scribbling like a madman. And here's some of my notes that I want to kind of show the audience. I've since translated these into an actual book so I can go back and review these. So thank you, by the way. I'm glad I was able to connect with you. And so when we talk about coronavirus, Dr. Code, the first question I have for you is there's trillions of viruses out there in the world. Why are so few harmful to us as a humanity or as humans?
Well, I think it's the person at the time and how they're set up, but virus completely present all the time and for millennia before. And even before we demonize it as a nasty infection, we have to let go of the idea that the virus is a living thing. It's really a piece of protein. So unlike a fungi or a bacteria or some variation in animal or plant, it doesn't have an ongoing agenda, but it likes to reproduce itself. And it has to do that, it has to attach into something. And so coronavirus, it was somewhat new to me too. I mean, I certainly knew about SARS because that was a big deal in Toronto here in Canada. And then, of course, later we heard about MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. But in reality, when you read about it, all of the flus and bugs that we have every season, about 15% of those are a coronavirus. So we've had them for quite some time, probably a very long time, but certainly in the last 30 years, they've been very present. And this one was a particularly somewhat different coronavirus. It had a better, more powerful spread mechanism. And I think the other thing is that because of its ACE2 receptor, and those are angiotensin converting enzyme, but ACE2 receptors, which are present in our nose and pharynx or throat and mouth, and then of course down in the first part of our stomach and intestine, and then also partway through there. But they're also present everywhere in the blood vessels, in the lining of the blood vessel. There's so-called endothelium. So that's why it can really have any degree of effects on us because we have blood supply everywhere. And so all of a sudden we had something that gives strokes in very young people. That was one thing. And some people found kidney disease, where they were getting short of dialysis in New York. And then another group found some degree of liver disease. And then, of course, the so-called classic one, the ground glass, both lungs pneumonia. So here we had something that could affect everybody's system. And that was why we started to need to, say, what can we do that will individualize and help everyone? And I think we found some of those pieces. And some hospital centers have worked hard and embraced all those, and some have gone with their traditional methods. And so it's a little frustrating from the outside, but everybody kind of reinvents the wheel. And I guess that's not a new issue within medicine. We go with what we're used to, and we go with what we're common with. But, this has had so much play, as you've talked about. I mean, in 3 months now, and an ongoing out front frustration with it. And now everybody's continuing to reclaim it. Everybody is uncertain what to do. So I look forward to your questions to try and focus. What do you think are the key ones that we could comment on today and make a difference in?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great one. Now, obviously, the virus, as you said, is not a living thing. It needs to get inside our cells to do any kind of damage. And from what I've read, the vast majority of viruses that do get into our bodies bounce off the cells, cannot get in, and then therefore excreted from the body somehow. But this one has this tendency to attach to an ACE receptor on the cells, and therefore then makes its way inside the cell. Are there certain populations, Dr. Code, or certain types of people that tend to have more of the ACE receptor, meaning they'll allow the virus to get into the cell more easily than others? And what are the factors for those?
Sure, and there is, certainly people that have high blood pressure, hypertension, they tend to have more ACE receptors. And if they're on one of the ACE receptor blockers or ACE2 inhibitors, then that tends to increase them. The jury's a little bit out on that, but certainly we know that people with already some degree of vascular problem, and in that group, we of course have type 2 diabetes, but we also have obesity, because 1 pound of fat has 8 miles of blood vessels. And so you have much more potential risk issue from that ACE2 type. So I think if we can try and separate it out in those groups, what are the most vulnerable groups? And of course, secondarily, that tends to be the elderly. It's not comprehensive, but it certainly tends to be the elderly.
Gotcha. So then, there's the individualistic pieces that you mentioned, which is the ACE2 receptors and the certain segments of the population that have them. There's also how much, or talk of how much of the viral load you're getting in and how strong your immune system is, which seem to be some other factors that have a dose-dependent response, or actually have something to do with how much, or if you actually get the coronavirus. So, if somebody's talking to you, is that enough? Is somebody sneezing on you? Obviously, it's a lot of droplets. What's in the literature, what we're learning? Is there a certain time you spend with somebody, or they have to sneeze on you for you to have enough of the viral load?
Well, that's right. And so I think what everybody has tended to forget, and there was an interesting paper came out today out of Barcelona, where they found it in the sewage water in March 2019. So that's pretty interesting. So I'm sure somebody else has kept sewer water to test it for any number of things. And so we need to find out if that's the case, because then we've had it a year and a quarter already. And, I like the premise that these things kind of come and go roughly on a 2-year cycle. So maybe by March next year, we'll kind of be adapting to it. But the other piece I think we forgot, viruses are pretty tiny. They're 0.125 microns. Okay, so that's super little. Just to give you an idea, I always talk about the microvasculature in the brain and the heart, and that's 5 to 100 microns. 100 microns is 0.1 millimeters, so we're still pretty tiny, but 0.125 microns can travel around very well on a particulate matter in their air. So a classic one would be the 2.5 microns, which gets well into the lung all the way down, because anything under 5 microns gets into the lung, you breathe it. Just as a reference point, a red blood cell is 7 microns, okay? 7, anyway. Mm-hmm. And so we probably had a lot of this move around the world into trade winds, frankly. Now, if we weren't outside for a prolonged period of time and breathing it in a concentrated fashion, we didn't get so much of it. So just as you said, but if you put a family in a house, even a large house, for 12 hours, everybody's got it from each other because we share it around. So putting us all inside together, it really didn't make any great benefit. Not only that, but only as far as catching it from each other, it's reckoned to be only 0.3% of all the infectivity happens if you're outdoors. So maybe that's one reason it backs off a bit in the summer. Everybody tends to go outdoors and you share it in great spaces. And so having things all together in an outside, well, call it a stadium or maybe for a music fest, it's not going to be as big a deal. Now, it's a little different if everybody's heavily inebriated with alcohol or whatever, and now they're coughing and sputting, spittering and hugging each other and kissing and all these pieces. I mean, that's a game changer, right? But as far as the virus in the air, it dissipates a lot if you've got a little breeze, anything going on.
I got you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, when we talk about, there's other coronaviruses, right? There was, as you mentioned, there was SARS, MERS, Ebola, Zika. How is this one different and why is it spreading so fast?
Well, I guess there's two sides to it. It's spreading quickly, but not as quickly as we anticipated. The other piece that, as I mentioned earlier, about 15% of all the regular flu bugs that we get in the season are a coronavirus. So it's around every year. In fact, there's some suggestion that's why some people have relative immunity or maybe quite a bit of immunity. And maybe that's one reason they're asymptomatic. The other piece that's been interesting is when we make vaccines, like we make the flu virus vaccine every year, it's kind of updated and it's got a little bit on last year's flu viruses because you have to work with them for a while to get the new strains to work with. Those are cultured often on, part of the culture will be on the cells from dogs. And I guess dogs have a huge amount of coronavirus within their population. So correspondingly, we're not truly getting vaccinated against these coronaviruses, but they're kind of carriers within the system. And as a consequence, for example, if you had your flu shot in the last year or two, you actually had about a 36% worsening of your coronavirus uptake because when the immune system responds, it sometimes responds in that antibody response, which will make you better. But there's a second part of the immune response, and this is what's tricky about the vaccine creation now. It makes a difference. I will say it tricks the body, so you get the real virus, and now you can't deal with it as well because the immune system is confused or tricked from the earlier piece.
Is it confused because there was a different mutation of the virus, or it's just not built up its defenses?
It was a close enough cousin to the virus, so it had a response similar, but it wasn't, full on. We've always suggested and found it, in the measles vaccine and the measles virus is a good example. If you have the measles virus when you're a kid, you tend to get lifelong immunity. Whereas if you have the measles vaccine, you may not get lifelong immunity. And so then we did it several times and so on with top-ups. But even then, it doesn't give as much lifelong immunity. And in some cases, it even makes you susceptible to it.
I gotcha. Let's get into this. There's obviously, as we talked about, particulate matter, that when you're coughing, sneezing, when you're close, kissing, hugging, there's an increased risk of you transmitting the virus if you happen to carry it. I've also heard about surfaces where, when you speak or when you're having dinner and you're talking, those droplets will drop down and then stay on surface for a few hours. Does that still stand, or is that
I
misproven?
think they're softening and softening and softening on that. They don't persist near as well as they thought, whether they dry up and break down, because it needs some small amount of, I think, moisture to persist. So I don't think we've got near the risk factor we once had. In masks, I mean, that's a really controversial topic because people are either all in or all out. And now we're polarizing people. Are you a mask guy? Are you a non-mask guy? And now we can't get along. It's really got quite a nightmare. I mean, I wore a mask for years in the operating room, of course, for hopefully prevent infection in the patient. But, bacteria are 1 to 2 microns. Viruses are 0.125 microns. So the surgical masks, it reduces the water droplets for sure, but it really doesn't change the viruses moving in and out because it just isn't closed enough. And then the specialized masks that they use in the hospitals and so on, they don't even keep it out. They keep a bit of it out. But the downside of masks is, remember, this is a virus which irritates and collects in high numbers, and then it attacks in the nose and in the throat. If you've got the mask on, all of those are super concentrated over a period of time. And you're taking away one of your body's way to get rid of that virus load or breathe it out. So now it's concentrating in on the mask, it's concentrating in here, and you're getting the secondary risk of increased trouble with your own personal infection and your own personal, sometimes secondary infection. Secondary infection would be now your immune system is localized and a problem in the area. So now you're getting a bacterial second infection. And one of the early ones that we've learned has been the Prevotella bacteria, which tends to be in gum disease and all these things in the mouth, but it can be a factor in the chest and the body, and maybe a factor even in the gut, because Prevotella is part of the microbiome in the gut. And the jury is still out. I was talking recently to a friend in the UK, and they're really trying to discover what is the risk factor in stool, for example. Early on, I got a letter from my local entity, and they said, close the lid on the toilet before you flush it. Well, we've all been in public toilets, they don't have a lid, so that gets more tricky. And we don't know that piece yet. And the one good thing about this, almost everybody in the world is trying to research and learn more about it. So we are making little baby steps uphill as far as wisdom and knowledge, which is great.
Yeah, so you got into the juicy stuff. I was going to wait for it a little bit, but let's talk about masks. That was a great answer, by the way. In one way, as you mentioned, it reduces if I have COVID, it reduces my transmission because I'm not coughing, sneezing. I don't have mega droplets in the air. But if you're on the receiving end and it kind of gets in anyway, then it gets concentrated, right? Because of the mask, you can't clear it out in the air. We just talked about being outside, being in the air, and if there's a mask on, then you're kind of reducing that supply or oxygen, and therefore you might have more of the virus accumulating in your mouth areas. Does putting a mask on also reduce your oxygen intake or oxygenation of your blood?
Well, it can do. It can do some, okay, because you're not going to breathe it in as well. And most of us, and certainly in young people, that won't be a very big factor. But you take someone elderly, older, with some respiratory compromise, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and those sorts of issues, a mask and a wet mask, I mean, you'll feel that you can't get enough air in because some of that happens. I mean, it's nice to have these filters all working well, and the nose and stuff is a great filter. But if it's all stuffed up and you've got this coating over top, it's unpleasant. So part of the issue is getting in the oxygen. But the bigger issue, I think, is a reminder. If you've got a cough and a sneeze and all these pieces, put a mask on to protect others. I get that. And that's completely reasonable. But that's probably where we should use it. It should be used with an awareness. And I don't know of a decent set of studies that have shown that everyone should wear masks. But it's really made a marker on people. And it can say, well, there's a mask group over there. And so, they're not going to talk to us without masks. I am pretty happy if I can maintain a comfortable distance from people and people aren't infected, especially if I'm outside. I think a mask is overdone.
Yeah, I agree with you. When I go outside, I take walks because the gyms are closed. Yeah. You've got to get outside. And so when I'll take a walk, I don't typically wear a mask. And now in California and in other states, they're kind of starting to mandate that you must wear a mask when you go outside, which is ironic because I'm at least 10 feet away from everybody else, right? I'm not in their face. I'm not talking to them.
Well, exactly so. And it's almost, I don't know if we're going to talk about control issues or not, but you can really tell if people are listening to you, what you're telling them to do, if you've got a great marker like a mask.
Yes. And now we're getting into other conspiracy theories, which I don't know if they're conspiracy or not, so let me get into this one, which is, Dr. Ko, do you think coronavirus actually came from a natural animal organism, or was it created in a biolab?
Well, I honestly think from what I have read about it, it was probably created in a biolab and released, I suspect, accidentally. It's unlikely it was done on purpose because they hadn't finished with it yet. I mean, it had all those markings that it had been worked on in a lab progressively over time. And then, you can take any number of reasons, but it doesn't seem to look like an ordinary one in those shapes and forms, because it's got pieces of HIV in it. It's got pieces of SARS-1, so call it, within it. So it doesn't seem to make that cutoff. I think there was some human assistance or engineering or upgrading the function, whatever one you want to term it, and then it got into the loop. I really have looked at enough of it. I don't think it all happened in that Wuhan market. I just, that way over the top. It might have been down the street from it because it wasn't too far from there that there was a biosecurity 4 lab. But it also is a big factor, I think, with the quality of the air around you. And the quality of the air really adds an extra piece. I listened to an interesting talk by Dr. Zach Bush the other day. He was talking very much, it's the quality of the air, because now there's something that's in the air. Maybe it's making a difference on your hemoglobin cells, almost like a cyanide toxicity. And that's why the extra oxygen is needed. And, I think we've missed the piece on the extra oxygen. Happily, they're about to release here where I live in British Columbia. That's about 4 million people. All the elderly, and I'm in that group now because I'm over 65, anyway, are going to be given pulse oximeters. You've seen these little clips on the fingertip, tells your oxygenation. Well, early on, if people went to hospital and they had symptoms of COVID, they would send them home with a pulse oximeter, and they would touch base with them and tell them, and I tell them too, because even before they were doing, because I used it a lot as an anesthesiologist. It came along in the 80s when I was studying to be a specialty anesthesiologist. because that's a great indicator of if your oxygen is dropping. And if it's dropping, you need some extra oxygen. And most of you might be able to do that at home with an oxygen concentrator. I mean, that's been a game changer. The people that used to sell bottled oxygen, they're going broke. They're selling 10% of what they were because everybody's got one that plugs in the wall, makes 5-10 liters a minute. I even use it when I exercise while oxygen training. But it's been a real help. And then Paul Harch and others, went on to show that if you've got a really bad case and you've got, really low oxygenation, we used to reach for a ventilator, and I used to run in ICU and work in ICUs and ran ventilators and all these pieces. We don't want to go to ventilators. We learned that the hard way with this one. So if you put them in an oxygen chamber a couple of times a day, they'll get better because they can get that oxygen up and the body can respond and treat it, and all of those cells can recover. So yeah, it's been a big, steep learning curve. And, I think just like they're filling up the hospitals in Houston now, Houston's got more hospitals than almost anywhere in the world because it trains all kinds of people. But they're back to the same challenges. Maybe they haven't learned too much more than New York did. And by the end of the game, I think they were trying to get ventilators left. But it's a tricky political walk.
Yeah, so man, there's so many ways we could go from there, but let's touch on ventilators. I wasn't taking coronavirus very seriously in the beginning days. I was like, oh, whatever, I have the immunity, I don't care, I'm young. But then a couple of my friends in their 30s got it, and they went to the hospital. They were in the hospital on a ventilator for 10 days each. And when they came out, they'd lost 30 to 40 pounds. They were just weak. And just looking at their picture laying there with the ventilator on just broke my heart. But one of the friends that came out, he said, I thought I was there for 2 days. I was there for 10. And so they lose sense of time. Luckily, he's recovered. He's working out now, and his voice came back, which they told it would take 6 months to come back. Wow. Luckily, all that's back. So then it became real for me. But I think I heard some people say, and then you might have also said, that putting people on a ventilator makes it harder for them to come out. Like 90% or 80% of people on a ventilator actually end up dying. Is that true?
Well, it's a mixed challenge. You see, whenever you put on a ventilator, part of it is positive pressure ventilation. So you're pushing the air in. When you push the air in, you get, we call it barotrauma, but you get pressure trauma. It's hard on the tissues. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't supply that much extra oxygen to the tissues. Not only that, it was really well presented by Dr. James. He put this in a paper following Dr. Harch's work. So he showed that this ground glass appearance that you get in both lungs is identical to the appearance that happens in the lung of someone who got out of an airplane at 70,000 feet. So that's twice as high as the average jet, right? But they've got out of those super high aircraft, and they've had a huge pressure difference by the time they get to the ground. And the same happens if you're, many feet under this ocean or water, and you come up rapidly, quickly, you get that same injury to the vessels. And it's partly hypoxia, and then you get return of oxygen, and now all the cells are damaged and injured. And positive pressure ventilation doesn't help. In fact, it aggravates it. It's an interesting, I can give you a little sidelight. Your friend thought it was 2 days. Well, it's a relative blessing. They're going to put you on a ventilator. They better sedate you because you can't handle it very well. It takes a really powerful individual to accept that breathing happening for them, unless they're super weak, and then you just kind of let it go. So they are on major medication to make them drowsy, even sleepy, and they don't talk about it much, but they relax the muscles or paralyze the muscles. So you don't want to be awake when you're paralyzed. That is a very unpleasant feeling. So it's those combination of pieces. And it's a bit tricky, but I think we need to talk about it because in parts of the world, there's been a relative compensation out of a different pot of money. And if you go on a ventilator, you get a huge increase in the pot of money, and the hospital wins, and I guess the doctor wins, but the patient doesn't win.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky, unpopular thing to talk about, but we need to have the individual patient's best interests at heart, and we need to educate all those healthcare people the best as possible.
Hmm. I agree with you. Yeah, it's definitely hard. In fact, my friend, when he's on the ventilator, he just felt so sorry for himself. And he has recollections of being on the bed, but not really fully conscious. And I think at one point he said the doctor came up to him and said, "Hey, listen, you have to try harder. We're doing our best, but you have to try harder." And I think at that point he was like, "Oh my God, I could go. Like, I've got to do something." And something switched, and he thinks maybe that's why he came back, but that was just scary to just, hear about from him.
Yeah.
So yeah, the ventilators, I hear you on the funding, and I've heard that doctors are classifying patients that are coming for other morbidities or diseases as COVID patients to get more money from the institutions that be, the funding that's available in every country. But I don't know enough to comment on that. So I'll move on.
Not our
Yeah.
strength, you
Yeah.
know. So I get that.
Okay. So let's move on to what actually happens. So let's say that I'm out or somebody's out and they contract COVID from somebody else, right? What happens to your body? What do you start to feel, and how long does it take for you to actually start to get the symptoms?
Well, it takes 3 to 5 days usually, and it starts up here in the mouth and nose. Okay. And those are the things that we tend to notice first. And sometimes it happens, but most often it doesn't. I mean, some of the airports are getting back into temperature control. When we went into Nairobi, Kenya last year, because we were on an African trip, it was routine when you traveled between different borders, you had your temperature taken because they were worried about Ebola transfer. Okay. So some of these viruses give huge temperature spikes. Coronavirus doesn't usually, it can, but it doesn't usually give a temperature spike. It's a relatively late sign.
Mm,
Oxygen hunger, but you'll have the sneeze, sniffles, and all these upper respiratory symptoms, and it may be the real deal, and you can't tell. It may be the not so real deal from another virus or flu. It's amazing. Nobody's talked about having the flu now for 3 months.
yes.
Did it disappear? I don't think so. But we were so focused on coronavirus that maybe it is. And so then we got into testing, and testing has its own set of challenges, and we continue to learn. Gosh knows we're getting into millions being tested now, so hopefully we'll learn all the right things about it. So usually it starts with that upper respiratory thing. Some people get chest discomfort. Some people, sort of chest wall pain, call it. And then some people get these other interesting things, COVID toe. So now it's happening. They've got a black or a blue toe or finger or these sorts of things. And some people are getting, as we talked about earlier, the earlier, much younger than normal stroke. Well, because there's a piece that happens with this virus, especially it seems, maybe because it's acting on the endothelium, the lining of the blood vessels throughout the body. But if you have lining on the blood vessels throughout the body, extra fibrin, which is one of the clotting mechanisms in the body, think of the little fibrils, they're right laying along there. Anytime we get an infection, we tend to get hyperclotable. And 20% of the population, roughly, are in that hyperclotable group. They're probably much more at risk for injury from the COVID-19 virus, for the simple reason that the virus ramps up that clotability a little extra. So now you can imagine there's a clot happening on the blood vessel supply to the toe or the finger. Now it's not normal color because it's short of blood flow and secondarily short of oxygen. And if that's happening in your kidneys, now you got kidney disease. Happening in your liver, you got liver disease. Happening in your brain, you got a stroke or some variation thereof. So the anti-clotting has been a really useful piece in the system. Now, when they recognize it in a major hospital, they put you on a blood thinner like heparin in short order. I've been encouraging people to take their own personal blood thinner. I think I'm probably in that 20% of hyperclotable ordinarily. I have my own chronic illness already with MS, so I'm more at risk of that. Folks that have a chronic illness, and maybe this is a piece that we should send out to everybody. If you have a chronic illness, you probably have hyperclotability. Now, if you have reduced clotability, so in the so-called hemophilia tract, usually you've got that diagnosed by the time you're in your teens or sooner, and all of a sudden now you're in a different group. So that's 5 to 7% of the population, okay? Whereas the hyperclotability group, and that's why the chronic illnesses may be a huge factor because they have a blood vessel and excess clotting. As soon as you increase that clotability, you have that extra layer inside the blood vessel. And that reduces the oxygen flow across there hugely, maybe by a factor of 5 times. And so instead of going through in a second or two, it may be many, many seconds to travel across. So now those tissues out there, they don't have enough oxygen to get by, and some of them start to do poorly, or they get the secondary inflammatory response or cytokine storm. And then it all starts to make sense and fit. So my suggestion is a simple one, relatively, nattokinase, 100 milligrams twice a day, and usually you can reduce that challenge. And now I've increasingly recommended it to all of my long-term patients with a chronic health problem, whether that's mold sensitivity challenges or Lyme, or the host of other blood pressure and all these other issues. Think about doing that ongoing, relatively anti-clotting mechanism to get you more in that even keel in the middle.
And that's a supplement that comes from natto, right? So you can get it from a health food store?
It's fermented soy, so you can get it in your pharmacy or health food store.
Okay, so that's a general recommendation. Even without noticing any symptoms, you should just get on that as a protective mechanism to smooth things out.
Yeah, I can't quote a study per se that shows that, but it makes sense to me. A, it's not harmful. B, it's fairly inexpensive. And C, it might improve your chances of not getting severe COVID and an injury.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. Now, you also have, Dr. Code, a protocol or a few recommendations that you listed when people do sense that they might have contracted COVID or might be in the early phases of it. Do you want to walk people through what you might recommend as people can do themselves without going to a hospital first?
I think because we're in a COVID era, everybody should be doing a gram of vitamin C twice a day. That's what I would suggest. If you think you're getting COVID, I'd ramp it up. I'd take a gram every hour. If I was getting really sick, I'd take it maybe every 10 minutes, okay? When we know we're getting a little bit too much oral vitamin C, we get diarrhea. We can't cope with it, okay? So then back off 20%. But if you do that frequent oral vitamin C, if you're fighting a virus, the body really, really needs that vitamin C because we can't make vitamin C as humans, and we need it for its antioxidant principles. So vitamin C is one. I'm very huge on vitamin D, the sunshine vitamin. I would like everybody, in your age group, be doing at least 2,000 international units a day. Sounds like a lot, it's not. Or if you're 40 and above, 4,000 international units. But that's only 0.1 milligrams, okay? So vitamin D is profound. In fact, if I think I'm getting a cold or if I think I'm getting COVID, I'm going to take 100,000 units, international units of vitamin D a day for 2 days. And I know that won't hurt me, and it really sets me up for a much better recovery capability and recovery possibility. So then those are the two issues to start for. So vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin A, okay, there's probably enough in a good multivitamin to be 5,000 international units per day. But that is exactly the group that they would need to start with. And then the other one I would prefer that they be on would be zinc, 30 milligrams of zinc. And if you haven't been taking it, get on it as soon as you think that you contracted a virus, because that helps the immune system. But we've learned now too, zinc getting inside the cell helps the cell deal with the unhappy viruses it might be fighting on.
Okay, so Dr. Code, you said to fight off or give your body the best chance of fighting off coronavirus, do a few things: nattokinase, vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin A, and zinc. Those are very helpful to build your immunity and defense systems. Okay, you do all that. Now you still have a choice to make, which is, do you actually go to the hospital? Because at some point you're going to realize you're out of your depth. You don't actually know if it's the flu. You don't know if it's a corona. So at what point do you decide to go to a hospital?
Well, I would like to hedge my bets a little better. So I would now, I'm worried about coronavirus, and everybody is. If I could, I'd go out and buy a pulse oximeter. Mm-hmm. You can buy them in a major drugstore, the bigger department stores. We don't need to mention names. Everybody knows what they are. And you'd buy a finger clip and you'd put it on your fingertip and you see. And most of you who's sitting up, young person, you'll be 97 to 99%. Okay? So that's really good oxygen saturation. And now all of a sudden you think you're getting a cold or a flu. Well, then I'd put it on twice a day. Or if I feel I'm short of breath, I'd put it on. And now if it's dropped below 90, now I need some help. So I better go to the hospital so I can get extra oxygen. Or if I've got access to it, I've got a friend or a neighbor or a parent that had an oxygen concentrator, then I'd put it on. And I'd put on the nasal prongs, at least 3 liters a minute, because it doesn't feel like a wind tunnel in your nose. And I've had several friends that's enough to keep them out of hospital, because initially that's all the hospital will do is give you a nasal oxygen. It's incredibly healthy, incredibly safe. We've said it's dangerous. Well, sure, it's on the risk factor if you're going to smoke cigarettes while you're doing oxygen. But that doesn't explode near as often as you might suggest it does. But the extra oxygen will really often tide things over, and you'll see it improve the pulse oximeter. It'll maybe bring it back up to 94, 95. Well, you're in pretty good shape then. Now you've bought some time for your body to deal with this problem. So if you're doing those other pieces ahead of time, got the pulse oximeter, that may be enough. And then, meanwhile, you're checking around if I have to go somewhere, where they seem to be doing, let's call it an enlightened, pretty progressive way of treating you rather than just slamming you on a ventilator and saying, see ya, Charlie.
That's great. That's a great way to put it. Now, how does a layperson figure out that exact point if they're enlightened or not, the hospital is?
Well, it's not easy, but as time has gone on and we've got more and more people are pretty sharp. You want to go to the places where they seem to be having a good response. It got a bit tricky in places like New York, and it'd be the same in Los Angeles. It's a major city. And if you go into a very poor hospital that almost all the poor people have to go to, then they're going to have their challenges, and they're going to, be using older style methods. I'm sure watched the video out of Elmhurst Hospital in New York. The places, unfortunately, will get rewarded from the state usually for COVID-19. So it comes out of a whole different budget. So you want to have somewhere where they'll optimize the treatment for you.
Okay, so do your research.
If I was hitting people at the door with it and they had to be admitted because they had positive COVID-19, I'd give them 6 days of hydroxychloroquine. That'd be my personal treatment. And I'd give them 6 days of probably azithromycin or Zithromax, because that's the Prevotella to help that secondary bacterial infection. And that helps reduce the problem in a lot of people. I don't get too excited about the worry about hydroxychloroquine and being toxic, because people have taken it 20 and 30 years. We've had the drug for 70 years, and it's extremely unlikely that 6 days is going to cause a toxicity when people can be on it for decades.
Mm-hmm. No, that's fair.
All drugs are a cost-benefit ratio.
Right. Who said it? The drug is the dose or something? Was it Socrates or somebody? Anyway, the dose is the poison or something? I forget what the actual saying is.
Well, you need to use it in the right amount, the right dose. You're completely correct. And the shorter term, usually the less risk.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fair. Now, there's obviously a lot of talk about being asymptomatic. There's also a condition called pre-symptomatic, which is you don't show any symptoms and you're just right before that. What's the difference, and are you able to pass this on in both of those states?
As far as we know, before you get symptoms, you might even pass it on a day or two before. So how could you possibly know? Because you haven't any symptoms yet.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the group. And the other group is the asymptomatic. Okay. Asymptomatic means you have no symptoms at all and don't get any symptoms at all. Okay. Pre-symptomatic means at some point you're getting symptoms. So it's in that early stage, but you may be infectious and transmitting it for a day or two before that happens. Asymptomatic, you may go through the whole story. So I had a good friend in his late 50s, so still fairly young. Anyway, he got pretty sick with it. We were able to keep him at home with all the methods I just gave you, every single one, including the extra oxygen. His wife didn't get one symptom at all.
Wow.
And we have to guarantee that she had it. 2 weeks living together in the same modest-sized house, it just doesn't make sense otherwise. So she would be in the asymptomatic group. And numbers vary. It's at least 40%, but it could be as high as 80%. Probably it makes a difference in the age group. If you go into a care home of elderly people primarily, or fragile people with lots of health problems, there's not going to be very many that'll stay asymptomatic because they've got lots of reasons for it to become obvious. Someone healthy and well like yourself, pretty high chance it may be asymptomatic. And that's why I'm pretty anxious that we, get more of that testing of the antibody system, although it's still fraught. We still need some more information on it because they're saying, well, you might get it again. Oh, okay, maybe.
Speaking of, a friend of mine believes he got COVID. He was in Europe in February. He was hanging out with some people that had it. He found out a week later. So he came back. He had aches and pains for 10 days. He said he'd never been that tired in his life. So he figured he had it. Then he went and got the antibody test, which was positive. So he had the antibodies, which means he had the corona. Then he was going to hang out with some other people. And so he got tested again, just out of abundance of caution. And the test came back negative. So now he's like, oh my goodness, what do I do? Can I be exposed to somebody around it or not? Then he did a second test recently and it came back positive, meaning that he had the antibodies. So testing seems to be all over the place. And any recommendations on what people can do?
I feel still thinking, some antibody tests are slightly better than others. Some are approved and some aren't. So hopefully the FDA approved ones are, a little higher standard. But I think we may be looking at the normalcy of, some degree of fluctuation. And some days it's not going to be enough to show within the body on the test, but you still got the relative immunity. Because we have known for a long time, some people can have enough immunity, but it barely shows only on a very sensitive test that it's there. And so these are the pieces that we're learning, but we're learning reasonably quickly because we're doing thousands and millions now of tests. So everybody's kind of putting the information together and we just need to tease it out. It seems like the biggest challenge in testing in the world, as far as agreement on it, is the test done in Canada, the US, and the United Kingdom, Britain. Well, you and I happen to live in those places, so I hope they learn from the rest of the planet as much as possible soon.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here's another question, and this is an anti-aging longevity question, right? What I've heard from interviewing some other folks is that the thymus gland that sits right behind the breastbone that trains a lot of the antibodies in your body actually stops fully functioning and starts degrading at a very young age, even as early as your teens. And therefore, that is why as you get older, you are more susceptible to these common colds or flus taking you out, basically. And so in terms of the coronavirus and the war that you have to fight against a novel virus that your body's never seen before, how bad is that to your immune system in your 40s, 50s, and beyond?
Well, it's a very individual thing. First of all, most of your immune system continues to function. You can reduce its function somewhat over time if you don't have the optimal diet, and we talked about some of the nutrients for that. You can remove parts of that immune system. Some people had a abdominal injury and they had their spleen removed. Well, they're more at risk. People had their tonsils out at some time when they were a kid. That's part of our lymphoid immune system. Each of these are components to work the whole system together optimally. And then we talked about the tricked immune system. So you had your flu shot in the last year or two. Well, you're a little more at risk. Maybe it's equivalent to having had your tonsils out, all those pieces. So it's not a black and white. We would like it to be a black and white, but it's more of a continuum along the loop or the other. And, the virus is around. You give me a choice. I would rather do it now when I know everything about me is pretty healthy. And I just as soon have my personal virus. I'm not ready to have a COVID party because that'd be very unpopular anyway, I think. But it would just as soon deal with the virus. I mean, I have chosen not to have a flu shot for over 20 years. Years ago, when I worked in the operating room, you don't work, you don't get paid. I had a flu shot every year, but I'm over it now. I'm not going back.
Okay. So let's talk about, on that same note, let's talk about the vaccine. And there's been a lot of conspiracy theories, Dr. Code, which I'm sure you're aware of. Bill Gates is getting maligned every single day. They're saying he's behind all the vaccines that are causing problems and abnormalities in Africa and wherever else. And regardless of where he stands, but are vaccines good or bad for us? And the second loaded question on that is, are they being engineered for world domination?
Well, that's a big topic to cover. I've obviously got some thoughts on it. I'm okay with a vaccine if it's safe and effective. It's really hard to make either a safe or an effective COVID-19 vaccine. First of all, the vaccine seems to be mutating or different strains all the time. So you're going to give me a vaccine. Well, do I want the one that they developed over in Denmark or in Germany, or the one over in China, the one in Los Angeles, or the one in New York? They're probably all going to be a little different. So I don't know which virus I'm going to come up against. So maybe it's going to be hard to make that one optimal or effective. Okay. The safety factor is a challenge as well. I mean, we've been working on a SARS effectively vaccine for 15 or more years with all the regular careful planning and all these other issues, but we don't have it yet. I mean, we've been working on a flu vaccine, and we have one every year, but they're never more than 30 or 50% effective. Okay, so do I want to take the risk factor? So in some of those special vaccines that they've tried against the SARS virus and the other viruses along the way that were in that RNA virus group, sometimes we got a great antibody response. And at that time, we were still testing them on ferrets. So ferrets have a nose and throat very similar to humans. So it's a good thing to test respiratory or breathing type viruses against. So they gave it to them. They got a great antibody response. They seemed to have this other antibody response variation. They didn't know what it meant. And then they gave them the real virus. They all died. Because if you trick the immune system enough with your vaccine, that it may give you appearing immunity, but now you get the real deal and it can't handle it at all. The immune system has kind of said, yeah, I'm sleeping today, I'm not interested. So that's the tricky part about having a safe vaccine. And to rush it in 6, 12 months, when you couldn't achieve it in 15 years, that worries me a little. And that's why, I would choose, if I can, to avoid that.
So what would you recommend? I mean, right now, we are just socially distancing, right? Which seems to make sense. How long can humans go on without a human touch and without connection close to each other and live virtually?
Well, that's a really tough question because not very long. We're having a huge crisis. Not only are the children unable to learn as well, and especially if they're somewhat challenged children, they don't get the time and the patience and the attention. But at the same time, one sales that has gone up around the world is alcohol, because it's it's to help people handle stress, and it's kind of a socially acceptable method, but they're off the roof. Secondarily, child abuse, wife abuse, and problems with suicide, they're all ramped up. In fact, we're going to lose more people from those problems even than we are the coronavirus. And so we're getting a little distorted in our perspectives because people need that intermittent talk to people. They need the intermittent intimacy and all these pieces. I mean, lucky are the people, maybe they're in a large family, everybody stayed healthy and they're supporting each other. But if you're slapping them now that they're being thrust into poverty because they can't work, now you've got a whole new set of problems, because one of the predictors of well-being, even with this virus, like with most long-term illnesses, if you're into either poverty, unable to afford good quality food and water, you're somewhat hooped. You're not going to cope with that new challenge, in this case, the virus.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a very good point. And yeah, I totally agree. So we're way over, but I've got a couple more questions for you. Dr. Code, what are your top 2 or 3 anti-aging tips or longevity tips for the audience?
Exercise. You just can't beat it. So get out and walk, whatever you need to do. Out for a walk is a pretty acceptable thing even now. And then as close as you can to organic food. So in the United States, the Environmental Working Group, look at the Dirty Dozen, eat those as organic as you can. Eat the Clean 15 as much as you can. And those will give you guidelines and whatever you can do to reduce your intake of glyphosate or Roundup. So that means avoiding wheat, commercial potatoes, sweet potatoes, and sugar.
Very good. But you can have the organic versions of potatoes, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I know you've got a new book out, which is called Solving the Brain Puzzle. Why don't you tell the audience about that book?
Okay, well, Solving the Brain Puzzle, it came out last year, and it was a lot about my journey with helping my own brain with my MS and my migraine headaches, for that matter. I realized as I was writing this, there was a great deal of things that come understood, but all the components that in the brain have the same set of problems, whether that's inflammation. Well, that's the early start to your risk for heart disease, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and the whole gamut. So all of these things were the same, so we needed to look after them at the same time. And so 36 chapters written for the layperson. I'm very pleased with the secondary title my editor suggested was, the initial name is Solving the Brain Puzzle. The secondary title, A Complete Layperson's Guide to Achieving Brain Health. But I'm also extremely proud of my mentor, Dr. Andrew Weil, who I took my integrative medicine training with in Tucson, Arizona, and online, of course, quoted a very comprehensive and well-researched book. So, and he doesn't say those sort of things casually, and I'm very pleased that he was able to say that for me. So it's another tool that people can do. So I'm doing those ongoing podcasts almost weekly. We're taking this week off. It's a holiday in Canada, a holiday weekend where you live, July 4th. And we're going through kind of chapter by chapter. We started out with all the stuff on COVID-19, but now we're going through chapter by chapter, and you can learn more about that at drbillcode.com.
Great. So if you're listening or watching this show, check out drbillcode.com and definitely get a copy of his book, Solving the Brain Puzzle. Dr. Code, so you listed the website. Is there anywhere else that people can find you online?
Well, they can find it in Amazon, and they can find it, through Kobo and Kindle and Nook, all of these, and Apple Books. Each of these, have their own presentation in the book. And if you wanted audio, I've dictated the whole thing. It took quite a while, actually.
Oh my God, yeah.
But you can do the audio book at drbillcode, drbillcode.com.
Thank you so much, Dr. Code, for coming on the show. I'm going to have to get you back on. We're going to talk about MS, and we're going to talk about brain health very soon. So thank you for coming.
Okay. Have a great day.
Thank you.